Some people say that wars are won by generals and admirals, by strategic minds plotting movements on massive maps in distant command rooms. But sometimes, history turns on the smallest hinge, on the simplest idea that comes from the most unexpected place. This is the story of how a 19-year-old farm girl from Kansas, who'd never seen an airplane up close until 1943, changed the outcome of aerial combat in the Pacific with what her supervisor called the clumsiest fix he'd ever seen. Her name was Dorothy Mae Fisher, and this is how her hands, calloused from years of working her family's wheat fields, helped save the lives of dozens of bomber crews flying against the Japanese Imperial Air Force. If you're enjoying this story of courage and ingenuity, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true stories from history. Dorothy grew up in a farmhouse 20 miles outside Wichita, where the land stretched flat and endless in every direction. The youngest of 5 children, she learned early that nothing came easy. Her father had lost the farm during the Depression, and they'd spent years working as tenant farmers, moving from one property to another, always one bad harvest away from losing everything. By the time she was 12, Dorothy could drive a tractor, repair a combine harvester, and jury rig almost any piece of farm equipment with baling wire and determination. When Pearl Harbor happened, Dorothy was 17, finishing her last year at a rural schoolhouse where 40 students shared 4 grades. Her 3 older brothers enlisted within a week. Her sister Margaret went to work at a uniform factory in Kansas City. Dorothy wanted to join them, wanted to do something that mattered, but her mother needed her on the farm. So she stayed, working the fields, watching the sky, and waiting. The opportunity came in March of 1943. Boeing had expanded their Wichita plant, converting it to produce B-29 superfortresses, and they needed workers desperately. The company sent recruiters through every town in Kansas, promising good wages and the chance to serve the war effort. Dorothy's mother finally agreed to let her go, recognizing that a 19-year-old girl couldn't run a farm alone, not with her father's arthritis getting worse every winter. Dorothy took the bus to Wichita on a Monday morning, her few belongings in a cardboard suitcase. The city overwhelmed her at first, the noise and the crowds and the sheer number of people moving with purpose through streets she didn't know. She found a boarding house near the plant, sharing a room with 3 other girls, all of them new to the city, all of them eager and terrified in equal measure. The Boeing plant was unlike anything she'd imagined. Massive hangars stretched the length of several football fields, filled with the skeletal frames of bombers in various stages of completion. The noise was deafening, a constant symphony of riveting guns, grinding metal, and shouted instructions. Thousands of workers moved through the space, most of them women, wearing coveralls and headscarves, their hands moving with practiced precision. Dorothy was assigned to the armament section, installing defensive gun positions in B-17s that were being refurbished and modified. Her supervisor was a man named Harold Jennings, a former aircraft mechanic who'd been rejected from service due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp. He was gruff, but fair, and he recognized something in Dorothy's careful attention to the technical manuals. The work was grueling. 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, her hands cramping from manipulating wrenches in tight spaces, her shoulders aching from holding positions that the aircraft's designers had never intended human bodies to sustain. But Dorothy loved it. Every rivet she placed, every gun mount she secured, she knew that somewhere in the Pacific, a crew would depend on her work to survive. The first weeks at Boeing had been overwhelming in ways Dorothy hadn't anticipated. The technical manuals alone were intimidating, hundreds of pages of specifications and procedures written in a language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. But Dorothy approached them the same way she'd approached everything in her life, with patient determination and a refusal to be defeated by complexity. She'd take the manuals back to the boarding house, reading them by lamplight after her roommates had fallen asleep, translating the engineering terminology into concepts she understood from years of practical mechanical work. Her hands told the story of those early months. The skin on her palms cracked from the constant contact with metal and industrial solvents. Her fingernails, once kept neat despite farm work, became permanently stained with grease and metal filings. She developed calluses on top of calluses, layers of toughened skin that still couldn't fully protect against the sharp edges and awkward angles she encountered daily. Some nights, she'd lie in bed, her hands throbbing, wondering if she'd made a mistake leaving the farm. But then she'd think about her brothers, about Jack somewhere in North Africa preparing for the invasion of Europe, about Tommy on his destroyer in the Atlantic facing German submarines, about William training to fly cargo planes over some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. Her sore hands seemed like a small price to pay for the privilege of contributing to their safety, however, indirectly. The boarding house became a second home, though it was nothing like the farmhouse where she'd grown up. 6 girls shared 3 rooms on the second floor of a narrow building that had been a private residence before the war. Mrs. Henderson, their landlady, was a widow whose son had been killed at Guadalcanal. She ran the house with strict rules about noise and visitors, but she also made sure her girls ate properly and had clean clothes, treating them with a fierce maternal protectiveness that Dorothy came to appreciate. Evenings in the boarding house had their own rhythm. The girls would gather in the small common room, sharing letters from home, mending clothes, listening to the radio. Dorothy learned about lives vastly different from her own. Ruth, the schoolteacher from Topeka, had grown up in a world of books and ideas, where education was valued above almost everything else. Alice, the mechanic's daughter, had fought her father for years for the right to work in his garage, proving herself with every repair until he had to admit she was better with engines than any of his male employees. Emma, the youngest, had been engaged since she was 16, her entire future planned around a boy she'd known since childhood. They talked about what they'd do after the war, dreams that seemed both impossibly distant and urgently necessary to maintain. Ruth wanted to go to college, maybe become a principal someday. Alice planned to open her own garage, specialize in foreign cars that she knew would become more common once the war ended. Emma just wanted her fiancé to come home safely, wanted to start the life they'd planned before everything had changed. Dorothy found it harder to articulate her own dreams. The farm was there, waiting, but it felt like returning to that life would mean pretending the war years had never happened. She'd seen too much, learned too much, grown too much to simply slip back into the role of a farmer's daughter. But what else was there for a girl from rural Kansas with a high school education and hands that knew how to work but little else? The other women in her section became her closest friends. There was Ruth, a former schoolteacher from Topeka who could calculate angles and trajectories in her head faster than most engineers. There was Alice, who'd worked in her father's garage and could identify any problem with an engine just by the sound it made. And there was Emma, barely 18, who wrote letters to her fiancé stationed in Italy every single night, filling pages with descriptions of her day, as if recording the details might somehow keep her connected to a normal life that seemed increasingly distant. In July, their section received a new assignment. A B-17 had returned from the Pacific with significant damage, and the Army Air Forces wanted it studied and refurbished as a test platform for improved defensive armament. The bomber had been part of a squadron operating from bases in New Guinea, flying missions against Japanese positions in the Philippines and Indonesia. The tail gunner's position had been repeatedly targeted, and the current gun mounting system had proven inadequate against the maneuverability of Japanese Zero fighters. Harold gathered his team in front of the damaged bomber. The aircraft bore scars from its service, patched holes from anti-aircraft fire, and streaks of oil that spoke to engine troubles nursed through desperate flights back to base. The tail section showed the worst damage, the plexiglass shattered in several places, the gun mount itself bent and scorched. The problem, Harold explained, was one of traverse speed and elevation range. The standard tailgun mount allowed for adequate coverage in most situations, but Japanese Zero fighters had developed a tactic of approaching from below and behind, then pulling up sharply into a climb that took them out of the gun's effective range before the gunner could adjust. By the time the gun could be repositioned, the Zero had already completed its attack run and was diving away. The engineering team from Boeing had proposed several modifications, all of them complex and expensive, requiring significant retooling and weeks of testing. Command wanted something faster, simpler, something that could be implemented in the field if necessary. Dorothy studied the problem for days. She'd climb into the tail gunner's position during her lunch breaks, contorting her body into the cramped space, trying to understand the limitations from the gunner's perspective. The position was claustrophobic, with barely enough room to move, the gun mount's controls positioned in ways that seemed designed more for the aircraft's structure than for human operation. The tail section of a B-17 was never designed for comfort. It was a compromise between structural integrity, aerodynamics, and defensive capability, and the human gunner who had to occupy that space was almost an afterthought in the design process. Dorothy would wedge herself into the position, her knees pressed against the curved fuselage, her shoulders hunched to fit under the plexiglass canopy, and she'd try to imagine what it must be like at 20,000 feet, with the temperature far below zero, enemy fighters screaming toward you at closing speeds that gave you maybe 5 seconds to react. She started talking to veterans whenever she could find them. The Army Air Forces regularly rotated experienced crew members back to the States for training duties, and some of them would visit the Boeing plant to consult on modifications and improvements. Dorothy would seek them out during breaks, asking questions that went beyond the technical specifications in the manuals. What did it feel like when a Zero came at you from below? How much time did you really have to adjust your aim? What went through your mind in those seconds? One veteran, a sergeant named Patterson, who'd completed a full tour in the South Pacific, spent an entire lunch break with Dorothy, describing the 6 o'clock low attack pattern that the Japanese pilots had perfected. They'd learned, he explained, that the B-17's tailgun couldn't depress far enough to track a fighter that approached from below and then pulled up sharply. The attack gave them a window, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, where they could fire on the bomber without taking return fire. 2 or 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, Patterson said. But at the closing speeds involved, it was more than enough time for a skilled pilot to pour devastating fire into the bomber's tail section and rear fuselage. Patterson had seen good men die in that position. He'd seen tail gunners who'd frozen, overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the attack. He'd seen others who'd tried to compensate by prepositioning their guns downward, only to be caught out when the attack came from a different angle. The current gun mount was adequate for most situations, he told Dorothy, but against an enemy who'd figured out its weakness, adequate wasn't good enough. Dorothy took notes on everything. She filled a small notebook with sketches and calculations, trying to visualize the geometry of the problem. At night, she'd lie awake in her narrow bed, her mind running through possibilities. The engineers at Boeing were smart people, much better educated than she was, and they'd been unable to solve this problem without expensive retooling and weeks of delays. What made her think she could do better? But she kept coming back to something her father had told her years ago, back when she was learning to repair farm equipment. He'd said that sometimes the people closest to a problem are the ones who have the hardest time seeing the simple solution, because they know too much about why things are the way they are. An outsider, someone who doesn't know all the reasons why something can't be done, sometimes sees possibilities that experts have already dismissed. She thought about the farm equipment she'd fixed over the years, about how often the most elegant solution was just a matter of repositioning a lever or adding a simple mechanical advantage. She thought about her brother Tommy's letters from his destroyer in the Atlantic, describing how they'd modified their anti-aircraft guns, with improvised extensions welded by the ship's crew. The idea came to her on a Sunday, her one day off, while she was helping Ruth fix a broken chair in their boarding house. Ruth had suggested adding a wedge under one leg to compensate for the uneven floor, and Dorothy had suddenly seen the solution to the tailgun problem with perfect clarity. Monday morning, she approached Harold with a sketch she'd drawn on the back of a technical manual page. Her proposed modification was almost embarrassingly simple. A wedge-shaped shim installed between the gun mount's base and the aircraft's structure that would tilt the entire mounting system forward by approximately 15 degrees. This would extend the gun's downward elevation range without requiring any changes to the mount itself. Additionally, she suggested reinforcing the traverse mechanism with a spring-loaded counterweight, salvaged from damaged training equipment, that would allow the gunner to swing the weapon more quickly while maintaining control. Harold looked at the sketch for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he called over the lead engineer, a man named Robert Caldwell, who'd designed aircraft components for Boeing since before the war. Caldwell examined Dorothy's drawing with the skeptical air of someone who'd seen 1,000 impractical ideas from enthusiastic amateurs. But as he studied it, his expression changed. He started asking Dorothy questions, technical questions about load distribution and stress points, and Dorothy answered them by referencing her experience with farm equipment, translating her intuitive understanding into engineering terminology she'd picked up from months of studying the manuals. Caldwell took the sketch to his office. 2 days later, he returned with a full engineering analysis. Dorothy's modification would work, he concluded, and it would work well. The wedge installation would extend the effective firing arc downward by 18 degrees, exactly the range needed to counter the Zero's climbing attack pattern. The counterweight system would increase traverse speed by approximately 30%. Best of all, the entire modification could be implemented with materials already available, using techniques that any competent maintenance crew could handle in the field. There was just one problem. The installation looked terrible. The wedge, necessarily thick to handle the recoil stresses, gave the tail section an asymmetrical jury-rigged appearance. The counterweight mechanism, cobbled together from training equipment springs and modified ammunition can handles, looked like exactly what it was, a Farmgirl's improvised solution created with whatever materials were at hand. Caldwell called it the clumsiest-looking modification he'd ever approved for production. But it worked. They installed Dorothy's modification on the test aircraft in early August. A week later, a veteran tail gunner from the Pacific Theater, a sergeant named Williams who'd flown 23 missions and survived 4 fighter attacks, tested the new system at a training range. His report was enthusiastic. The extended downward range eliminated the Zero's blind spot approach, and the improved traverse speed allowed him to track targets through their entire attack run. The testing process had been more extensive than Dorothy had expected. Williams wasn't just firing at stationary targets. The Army Air Forces had set up a sophisticated training scenario using modified aircraft to simulate Zero attack patterns. They'd studied hundreds of combat reports, analyzed gun camera footage, and recreated the most common and most dangerous attack approaches that American bombers faced in the Pacific. Dorothy was allowed to observe some of the testing, standing in an observation post near the firing range, watching through binoculars as the modified B-17 went through its paces. She could see the tail gun tracking smoothly through angles that would have been impossible with the standard mount. When the simulated attacker pulled up from below, Williams kept firing through the entire climb, the gun following the target in a way that made Dorothy's heart race with a combination of pride and relief. After the first day of testing, Williams sought Dorothy out. He was a compact man, maybe 30 years old, but looking older, with the kind of face that had seen too much too quickly. He shook her hand with a grip that was surprisingly gentle and told her that her modification was going to save lives. He didn't say it with drama or exaggeration, just stated it as a simple fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. Then he told her about a mission over Rabaul, about how a Zero had come at them from exactly the angle that her modification now covered. His gun hadn't been able to track fast enough or low enough. The Zero had put a burst of cannon fire into their tail section that had killed their radio operator and wounded the ball turret gunner. They'd made it home, barely, nursing a damaged aircraft across hundreds of miles of ocean, but it had been close. Too close. With your modification, Williams said, I could have hit him. I could have at least made him break off, made him think twice about pressing the attack. Maybe Johnson would still be alive. Maybe we wouldn't have spent 3 hours wondering if we were going to ditch in the Pacific and drown before anyone could find us. Dorothy didn't know what to say to that. She'd been thinking about her modification in abstract terms, about angles and traverse speeds and mechanical efficiency. Williams had just made it concrete in a way that took her breath away. This wasn't just about clever engineering. It was about young men who wanted to live, who wanted to go home, who deserved every advantage that people like Dorothy could give them. The second day of testing included more complex scenarios. They brought in 3 modified aircraft to simulate a formation, testing how well the tail gunners could coordinate their fire with the new mounts. They ran attack simulations from every angle, including some that hadn't been common in actual combat, but that intelligence suggested the Japanese might try as American bombers pushed closer to the home islands. Dorothy watched it all, taking notes, asking questions when the opportunity arose. The engineers from Boeing were there too, documenting everything, measuring performance metrics, looking for any problems or weaknesses in the modification. They found minor issues, things that could be improved with small adjustments to the counterweight tension or the wedge installation procedure, but nothing that undermined the basic effectiveness of the design. On the third day, they brought in 5 more experienced tail gunners, men from different squadrons with different levels of experience and different combat backgrounds. The Air Forces wanted to make sure that the modification worked for different body types, different skill levels, different shooting styles. Some gunners were more aggressive, swinging their guns in wide arcs to cover as much sky as possible. Others were more conservative, making precise, small adjustments to track specific targets. The modification worked for all of them. Some adapted to it instantly, others took a few practice runs to adjust their techniques, but by the end of the day, every single gunner reported improved performance. More importantly, they reported increased confidence. They felt less vulnerable, less exposed to an attack pattern that had haunted their nightmares. One of the younger gunners, a kid from Wisconsin who couldn't have been more than 20, told Dorothy that he'd been terrified of his next tour. He'd completed 15 missions and had 10 more to go before rotation, and he'd been having nightmares about the 6 o'clock low attack. Now, he said, he felt like he had a fighting chance. He could focus on doing his job instead of worrying about the angle he couldn't cover. The Army Air Forces authorized immediate implementation. Within 2 weeks, modification kits based on Dorothy's design were being shipped to every B-17 squadron in the Pacific. Field crews could install the system in less than 6 hours. By September, hundreds of bombers were flying with what the crews had started calling the Dorothy Wedge, though official reports referred to it as the Fisher modification. The impact was measurable and immediate. B-17 squadrons operating from bases in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands reported a significant decrease in successful Zero attacks from the 6 o'clock low position. Tail gunners, previously vulnerable during the critical seconds of a climbing attack, could now maintain effective fire throughout the Zero's entire approach and climb. Several pilots credited the modification with saving their aircraft and crews during missions over Rabaul and Truk. Dorothy received a commendation from the Army Air Forces in October, a formal letter thanking her for her contribution to the war effort. Boeing gave her a $50 war bond and featured her in a company newsletter article about worker innovation, but the recognition that meant the most came in the letters. The first arrived in November from a tail gunner stationed in New Guinea. He wrote to thank her personally, describing how the modified gun had allowed him to drive off 2 Zeros during a mission over Wewak. He'd been certain they were going to die, he wrote, but the improved traverse speed had given him the split-second advantage he needed. He enclosed a photograph of his crew, 10 young men grinning in front of their bomber, alive because of an idea that had come to a Farmgirl while fixing a broken chair. More letters followed. a pilot from the 43rd Bomb Group who'd completed his tour and returned home, a radio operator whose aircraft had been badly shot up but made it back because the tail gunner had kept the fighters off them, a squadron commander who wrote to say that the modification had become so standard that new crews arriving in theater assumed it was original equipment. Dorothy kept every letter in a box under her bed. She didn't talk about them much, didn't like the attention when other workers in the plant heard about her contribution. She just kept showing up for her shifts, installing gun mounts, checking her work twice, knowing that somewhere over the Pacific, her efforts mattered. The war continued. Her brothers wrote when they could. Jack survived the invasion of Sicily. Tommy's destroyer made it through the Atlantic crossing 23 times. William flew supply missions over the Himalayas and returned home in the spring of 1945. Dorothy stayed at the Boeing plant, working through VE Day and then through the summer until the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered and suddenly the war that had consumed everything was over. The plant downsized immediately. Thousands of workers were laid off as bomber production ceased. Dorothy could have stayed, transitioning to civilian aircraft production, but she chose to go home. Her father had died that spring and her mother needed help with the farm. The skills Dorothy had learned in Wichita, the precision and attention to detail, the ability to see mechanical problems clearly and devise practical solutions, proved just as valuable in agriculture as they had in aircraft production. She married a local man in 1947, a veteran who'd served in Europe and came home with a quiet determination to build something lasting. They had 3 children and farmed the same land where Dorothy had grown up. She rarely spoke about her time at Boeing, and most people in her community never knew about the modification that had saved so many lives. His name was Robert Schneider, and he'd been a sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division, landing at Omaha Beach on D-Day and fighting through France and Germany until the surrender. He came back to Kansas with shrapnel scars on his left leg and a Purple Heart that he kept in a drawer and never displayed. Dorothy met him at a church social in the fall of 1946, and what drew her to him was his quietness, the way he seemed content to listen while others talked, the way he looked at the world with eyes that had seen terrible things but refused to become cynical. They courted for 6 months before Robert proposed, sitting on the porch of her mother's farmhouse on a spring evening, the wheat fields turning green with new growth. He told her honestly that he had nightmares sometimes, that there were days when loud noises made him flinch, that he wasn't sure he'd ever be completely free of the war. Dorothy told him about her own experiences, about the weight of knowing that her work had life or death consequences, about the letters from gunners thanking her, about how she'd carry those voices with her forever. They understood each other in a way that people who hadn't lived through those years couldn't quite grasp. They'd both been changed by the war, shaped by it, and they were both determined to build lives that honored the sacrifices they'd witnessed. Robert wanted to farm not just to make a living, but to create something growing and alive after spending years surrounded by destruction. Dorothy wanted to raise children in a world where they'd never have to know the fear and loss that had defined her generation. Their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after Dorothy's sister, was born in 1948. Then came 2 sons, Thomas and William, named after Dorothy's brothers. The farm prospered under Robert's careful management and Dorothy's practical efficiency. They diversified beyond wheat, adding cattle and chickens, putting in a vegetable garden that Dorothy tended with the same meticulous attention she'd once brought to installing gun mounts. The children grew up knowing their mother had worked in an aircraft factory during the war, but the details remained vague. Dorothy would answer questions if asked, but she didn't volunteer stories. She didn't talk about the cramped tail gunner positions or the letters from men who'd lived because of her ingenuity. She didn't mention the nightmares she'd had in the months after the war. Dreams where she was installing a gun mount and the bolts wouldn't tighten, where she'd see the face of a young tail gunner she'd never met, accusing her of shoddy work that had cost his life. Those dreams had faded over the years, replaced by the immediate concerns of raising children and running a farm. But certain things would bring the war years back with startling clarity. Hearing an airplane overhead would make her look up, and for a moment, she'd see not a civilian aircraft, but a bomber formation heading toward some distant target. The smell of machine oil would transport her back to the Boeing plant, to the noise and the urgency and the camaraderie of women working together toward a common purpose. Her children sometimes asked why she never attended veterans' reunions or war memorial events. Dorothy would say simply that she hadn't served in uniform, that the real heroes were the ones who'd fought and died, not the ones who'd worked safely at home. But Robert understood. He'd seen enough of war to know that heroism took many forms, that the people who'd built the weapons and equipment, who'd kept the economy running, who'd done 10,000 unglamorous necessary tasks, had served just as truly as those in uniform. The farmhouse walls held photographs that told the story of a life well lived. Margaret's college graduation, both sons standing proudly in front of their own farms, grandchildren at various ages grinning gap-toothed at the camera. But in Dorothy's bedroom, in a frame on her dresser, was a different photograph. It showed a B-17 tail section, and if you looked closely, you could see the distinctive wedge of her modification. A tail gunner, his face obscured by oxygen mask and flight helmet, gave a thumbs up to the camera. She'd received that photograph in 1952, mailed from Oregon with a note from a former crewman who'd found her address through a veterans association. He'd wanted her to see what her work looked like in the field, wanted her to know that crews were still flying with the Dorothy Wedge, that her contribution hadn't been forgotten by the men whose lives it had protected. Dorothy had written back, a brief note thanking him, but she'd kept the photograph where she could see it every day. In 1963, a historian researching wartime industrial contributions tracked Dorothy down. He was writing a book about American innovation during World War II and wanted to interview her about the Fisher modification. Dorothy invited him to her farm, served him coffee in her kitchen, and answered his questions with the same practical directness she'd brought to every challenge in her life. When he asked her how she'd known the modification would work, Dorothy thought for a long moment. Then she said that growing up poor on a farm had taught her to see past what things were supposed to be and focus on what they needed to do. The fancy solutions from the engineering team had been designed by people thinking about theory and specifications. She'd been thinking about a frightened young man cramped in a tiny space, trying to swing a heavy gun fast enough to save his life and the lives of his crew. The historian's book included a chapter on Dorothy's contribution, with photographs of the modification and testimony from several airmen who'd flown with it. But it was academic work with a small print run, and Dorothy remained largely unknown outside of aviation history circles. She died in 1991 at the age of 67 from cancer that the doctors said might have been related to her exposure to industrial chemicals during the war. Her children found the box of letters after the funeral, dozens of them, carefully preserved, each one a voice from the past thanking her for giving them a future. The B-17 that had served as the test platform for Dorothy's modification survived the war and was eventually restored by a museum in Ohio. The Dorothy Wedge remains in place, a visual reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions come from the most unexpected sources, from people who approach problems without the burden of knowing what the experts say can't be done. Today, when aviation historians discuss the B-17's defensive armament evolution, they note the Fisher modification as a prime example of wartime field innovation. It's taught in some military academies as a case study in practical problem solving and the value of diverse perspectives in technical development. But the real legacy of Dorothy's work isn't in the textbooks or the museums. It's in the photographs that hang on walls and houses across America, pictures of young men who grew old, who had children and grandchildren, who lived full lives because a teenage farm girl from Kansas looked at a broken gun mount and saw not an engineering challenge, but a human being who needed help. Dorothy never considered herself a hero. She'd done her job, she would say, same as millions of other people who'd worked in factories and farms and offices, each contributing what they could to a cause larger than themselves. But the letters in that box told a different story. They spoke of moments when skill and creativity and simple human concern had made the difference between life and death, between a bomber limping home and 10 families receiving telegrams they dreaded since the day their sons and brothers and husbands had deployed. The last letter in the box was different from the others. It had arrived in 1989, 2 years before Dorothy's death. It was from a man in Oregon, the son of a tail gunner who'd been killed over the Philippines in 1944. He'd found his father's letters home while cleaning out his mother's house after she'd passed away. In one of them, his father had mentioned the new gun modification, how it gave him confidence that he might actually survive his tour, how he'd written to thank the woman who'd designed it. The son wanted Dorothy to know that his father's last letter home, written the day before his final mission, had been full of hope and plans for the future. The modified gun had kept him alive through 8 missions before his bomber was hit by anti-aircraft fire that no defensive weapon could have stopped. But those 8 missions, those 8 times his father had faced Japanese fighters and come home safely, had been possible because of Dorothy's ingenuity. He wanted her to know that he existed because his father had survived long enough to request leave, to fly home for 2 weeks, to spend time with the mother he'd barely known. He wanted her to know that his own children, Dorothy's grandchildren by extension, carried forward a life that might have ended earlier without her contribution. Dorothy had framed that letter. It hung in her bedroom until the day she died, a reminder that the true measure of a life well lived isn't in recognition or awards or historical footnotes. It's in the quiet moments when our work, done with care and dedication and a genuine concern for others, ripples forward through time in ways we may never fully understand. The farm girl who'd learned to fix broken equipment with baling wire and determination had looked at a problem that stumped trained engineers and seen a solution so simple it seemed clumsy. But simplicity isn't the same as simplistic, and sometimes the most elegant answer is the one that works, regardless of how it looks. Dorothy Mae Fisher understood that truth in her bones, understood it from years of making do with what she had. of solving problems not because they were intellectually interesting, but because people's lives and livelihoods depended on finding solutions. Her story reminds us that genius can come from anywhere, that innovation isn't the exclusive province of experts with advanced degrees and prestigious positions. Sometimes it comes from a 19-year-old farm girl who'd never seen an airplane up close but understood, at a fundamental level, how to make things work. Sometimes the person who changes history is the one who asks the simplest question: what do the people using this really need, and how can I give it to them? That question, asked with humility and answered with creativity, saved lives. It brought men home to their families. It gave tail gunners those few extra seconds they needed to defend their aircraft and crews. And it proved that in times of crisis, when nations mobilize every resource and call upon every citizen to contribute, the most valuable contributions sometimes come from the most unexpected places, from hands that know the weight of real work and minds that understand that the best solution is always the one that serves the people who need it most.